Good morning, everybody. Okay, I have a quick announcement before Jan takes over. I know some of you have been asking the question about the final paper that we wrote in the instructions that you need to write something from your own context. And the question was, does it have to be really from my own context, or can I choose something that's not my own context but I am interested in and I can write about? And I wanted to clarify, the issue of your own context was intended to make things easier on you, or to give you a possibility to reflect on something that is close to you. But it's not exclusive. So if you feel that you can write better about a topic that is as remote as it gets from you and your context, please do that. If you feel like, no, I'm comfortable to write something that I'm familiar with, and that was the intention, then do that as well. And we will correct the instructions for next year to make sure there is no confusion like that. Any questions? Easy? Okay, very good. Jan, you're on.
Morning, everyone. So as you can see, we want to talk, this session is, I want to talk about the environment, conflict, and security. Three huge themes that I try to mix. I will focus on older theories of environmental security, older in the sense of being old in academic terms, but they are still being talked about today, especially in the mainstream and in the non-academic world. Climate change is again bringing all these issues back. Environmental security is a field that started to appear in the early 1990s and is now again in the forefront of some of these bigger conflicts that we have seen. What happened in the early 1990s? You remember? Were you already alive? I'm not talking about the ozone, but it's true, that happened too. What else happened like in the world? End of the 80s, early 90s. The end of the Cold War, right? The collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is, let me remember, I don't think I have a slide on that exactly, no. So I have some slides, I will go through them, but I will talk about the first part with this title slide in place. So environmental security came out around that time, and there's different theories of why this happened. Why did the environment become a security threat? Why was it seen as a security threat? And one is what Susanna was saying, there were some environmental issues that were becoming more visible, right? The ozone layer was disappearing in some parts. We had a hole in the ozone layer. It's also one of those examples where the world actually reacted to a global threat and managed to deal with it. There are not many of those examples. There was also deforestation occurring, right? Again, like today, people were worried about losing tropical forests, biodiversity. But what else? From the other side, from the security side, imagine, we've had the Cold War, decades of investment, of resources pouring into security, military, into the intelligence apparatus, right? Satellites, observation technology, military equipment, training people. All these issues suddenly were left without a need. Right? What would we do, let's say from the northern perspective, what would nations do with all that stuff? There was no more Cold War, there was no more enemy, there was no more threat. So some say that the environment became or replaced that threat. Right? So there was a reason given to the states to maintain the military and the security thinking and also the material or the apparatus of all that intelligence and military, how do you say that, world stuff. So in the environment, the military and the intelligence services found a new enemy. Then something happened a few years later that displaced the environment as the main threat to national securities. Do you remember what happened about 10 years later in the US? 9/11, right? Terrorism became a new threat, and the environment got pushed back down. And also in academia, the thought about environmental conflicts fell considerably. Research output, master degrees were decreasing in a sense. That were those the ones that were looking at the environment as the main threat. And so that's kind of the history of environmental security as a discipline. And as I said, now it's coming back very strongly. Terrorism is still there. There are other big threats to national security, but the environment is coming back, right? And many different things that only a few decades ago were not linked to the environment are now again linked to the environment. For example, migration. What do I mean by that? We think about Europe, we think about the wall, the Mexican or the US wall. Mexican because the Mexicans should pay for it, right? Keep their own people on their side. I'm being sarcastic, right? Okay. So migration can be linked to environmental change, to environmental disasters, to scarcity, right? And what happens in the Mediterranean, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but if you read the news once in a while, you've seen something about that. People trying to get into the European Union, drowning, a lot of horrible things happening, also in the, not only on the sea, but in several countries of Europe, where people are being held in horrible conditions. That is partly blamed on climate change, right? So it's again an environmental, so-called environmental issue. Before I go into this and the more details of environmental security, this is another way of looking at the links between environment and conflict. This is maybe not the most interesting, but it's important. So whenever there is a conflict, there will be impacts on the environment, right? So that you can think of three different types of impacts: the direct, the indirect, and institutional impacts. Direct impacts are direct impacts, right? You have the physical destruction of an ecosystem, right? Think of bombs falling in a rural area. Think of planes flying over, spraying pesticides on forests, right? Think of, even in the past, armies marching through territory and burning everything behind them, so that the advancing enemy couldn't feed themselves. And impacting the environment can be a weapon, right? You can, in many conflict situations, you can observe certain very nasty activities. I mean, shooting at somebody is a nasty activity, but throwing dead bodies into a well, right, is contaminating the water, is prolonging the impact. It's a weapon, right, against civil society. So it can be intentionally or not. Having an army going through an area, tanks driving through a forest, that will have an impact on the environment. Indirect impacts. And again, we can think of migration again as an issue. These are basically coping mechanisms of, again, communities, individuals, societies to deal with a changing reality. Right? In a war, there might be no trade, there might be scarcity of food, so people start hunting more or entering national parks, destroying the environment in that way. And migration comes back there because sometimes people just move away from their region and place extra pressure on the resources of a new region. Right? So if we had, for example, a civil war going on in Costa Rica, and people from Punta Arenas would move all the way up here from Jacó and come to Ciudad Colón, we would have to deal with that, right? Double the amount of water demand, waste production, food demand, and all these things. The last one, institutional impacts, refers to the issue of a state being busy in a conflict cannot deal with certain issues, right? So if a country is at war, the environment is not the priority, right? Environmental regulations become less important. And not only environmental management, but also infrastructure and all other things suffer, of course. So there's a general lack of governance, and then again, people start doing illegal activities that might impact the environment. Okay, so this is a whole field of study that one can go more into detail. I just wanted to show you this side of the story, but this is not actually what I want to talk about. So this is a way some authors organized environmental security, the discipline, and I kind of use that. I think it's an interesting model because it shows that it's so diverse, right? So what we have here is different referent or levels of analysis. What is the focus of the analysis, right? In this one here, there is a source of insecurity coming from environmental change. Okay? Environmental degradation, environmental change is a source of insecurity of the state. So it's national security under threat from environmental change. This is the typical environmental conflict discourse. And in the past, environmental security really began like this. Okay? The second level, again, the source of insecurity is environmental change, but we're not looking at the security of states. So the focus shifts from national security to individual people, to communities. Okay? How does climate change affect us as individuals, or the community of the Rodeo, or farming communities in China? Right? There's a focus on human security. The third one is changing. Right? Here, the source of insecurity is not environmental change, it's human activity. And the one that is being so-called attacked, which is under threat, is the environment. Did we talk about realist perspectives? Do you know about these things? International relations? Doesn't matter. Not at this moment. This has to do with looking at the world as a group of states, individual states with their own sovereignty. They're only interested in their own well-being. Right? In an environmental perspective, realism means we're all doomed. Right? Because we will never cooperate. We'll always compete. And therefore, that explains why the focus is on national security. The environment, instead of seeing it as a global threat to all of us, it's seen as a national security issue. So, summarizing them, we can see the environment as a threat to national security, as a threat to human security, and we can also see the environment being under threat from human activity. Okay? And the rest of my session will be talking about these three linkages individually. Sorry for my boring PowerPoints. I was thinking yesterday of making them nicer, but I didn't. It just didn't happen. Okay, so the first one, the environment as a threat to national security, the classical or the original environmental security perspective, right? There's two main theories here. One is that environmental scarcity leads to social unrest and possibly to violence and even resource wars. Right? These are theories. And the other one, which kind of goes against this, is saying it's actually the abundance, the existence of certain resources that seems to be linked to the appearing or to the possibility of conflicts happening. Right? So these are two theories. I'll look at them in detail. The first one, this is coming from one of the famous environmental security scholars from the 1990s, Thomas Homer Dixon, from the School of Toronto, Toronto University. He created kind of this framework of explaining how environmental scarcity can lead to conflict. And he splits up scarcity, environmental scarcity, into three different levels or three different types. And this is going to be part of the discussion of the seminars today as well. So, demand-induced scarcity. If we think about resources, natural resources as a cake, as a pie, okay? How do you picture a demand-induced scarcity? So we have a pie of a certain amount of resources, and there's an increase in demand. Right? So there's, let's say, is it not a good example? It is? So suddenly there's 20 more people wanting the pie, wanting a piece of pie. Right? The resources are exactly the same, but there's more demand for it. Therefore, there's scarcity. This explanation is often linked to Malthusianism, right? Demand can only grow if there's more people, which is not true. Right? Demand can grow in many different ways. Certain resource can be suddenly more important in the economy of certain countries or in the production process of certain materials that we produce. Then the demand increases, and then we have scarcity. What about the second one? Supply-induced scarcity. We have the same amount of people, the pie is shrinking. How? Ants ate half of the pie. There was a hole in the roof and water fell on the pie, right? There's less resources available. If we step away from the pie example, we talk about degradation, right? Or overconsumption of a certain, overuse of a certain resource, the resource amount shrinks. The demand is the same, but there's less stuff there. Okay? And the third type of environmental scarcity, according to Homer Dixon, is structural scarcity, what he called structural scarcity. And this means that the cake is here, and I decide who can eat it, right? Because I have the power. I can say only you guys will have cake. you won't. Right? Then you feel scarcity. So in the seminar, I want you guys to discuss that. Is that an environmental scarcity issue really? Or is it something else? These three things are different things, right? They have different causes, different consequences. If we just mix all this rich diversity of issues and call it environmental scarcity, then it's easy to say that environmental scarcity causes conflict. It's easy to come to that conclusion. If you go a bit deeper, you might think, well, actually, maybe this is not really an environmental issue at all. It's an issue of power, right? It's an issue of justice. Anyway, oftentimes, simple explanations are better, right? To convince people, to convince politicians, and to sell books, right? To convince people who don't know anything about it. It's better if it's simple than you feel when you read it, oh yeah, that makes sense. That guy is really smart. Because I understand it. So, to be fair with Homer Dixon, who is not a stupid person at all, he's a very, very intelligent person. And there's actually a lot of debate about how to read what he was writing about, how to understand the nuances of what he was saying. My criticism of him at the beginning was based on me not understanding him, right? And having people on my side that could explain why he was wrong very convincingly. I still think his theory is kind of dangerous because it simplifies a very complex issue. But it's not that simple. So he said, for example, these two things have to happen together with environmental scarcity for there to be the potential for conflict. The first one is people need to feel deprived of something. Right? We already talked about deprivation. Remember? A few days ago? Relative deprivation, I think it was called. So, when people feel that something has changed in their life, can be real or not, the perception of, I am not getting what I deserve, I'm suffering more than others, you know, that makes me angry, that makes people angry. And the word potentially is important. And these guys, or this research team around Homer Dixon uses that word a lot. The other thing that has to be present is that the state should not have or cannot have the capacity to actually deal with issues before they escalate. Okay, so this is important. When the state is super weak, any type of deprivation, any type of unwell being, or how do you call that? Of unrest, of potential conflict is of course multiplied. Right? When the state can interfere quickly, good, but if the state is absent or non-existent, then of course you have more potential for people doing whatever they want. And oftentimes that can mean violence. If you have any question or comment, please interrupt me. You still with me? Yes? So, there are a lot of counter arguments to this whole scarcity, environmental scarcity causing conflict. And some of them come from, let's say, anti-Malthusian thinking. Right? People who say, so Malthusianism, you've heard that term before? Basically blaming population size, population growth for all the bad things in the world. Again, a simple explanation that makes sense. If you think about it a bit more, it starts to become less convincing. But obviously there is some truth to that. Right? So there were already throughout the last 200 years, people arguing that we cannot just blame the size of populations for everything. And some say actually that when we have a situation of scarcity, that can actually mean that the society reacts to that and come up with innovative ideas to become more efficient, to start trade, right? Diversifying the economy, start dealing with neighbors. Maybe they have that stuff that we are suffering from scarcity of a certain resource. Maybe we can buy it from them. We can trade. But this one, that actually having a lot of people, and let's say there are a lot of people in a certain country, and there's a scarcity because of that amount of people, and people will start to react to that, to the need of finding new ways of making a living. Right? If we are all farmers and we have only a very limited area of land to farm, in this or the next generation we're going to have problems. Right? Because our children will not be able to farm with the same amount of income that we make. So they have to do something else. Maybe they can become a mechanic, or maybe they can become somebody who cuts trees and builds houses, right? So very simple things really. That's how a village functions, right? We don't normally do all the same thing. So these are just two general examples of, let's say, counter-arguments to that point of view that scarcity will always lead to conflict. And then there's the other one, remember? Yes?
Yes, I have a question on scarcity. The author doesn't really deal with hierarchy. I don't need a microphone, I talk around. Surely there's a hierarchy of resources. Some resources are more important to some people than others. I like pecan pie a whole lot more than I like apple pie.
Good point.
So,
Yeah. You don't care if there's too many people for one apple pie.
No,
Right.
no. But in the natural resources, oil is very important to some people.
Absolutely.
Wheat production is more important to others. So how does that play into the author's
Absolutely.
discussion?
I'm getting there, but yes, we're actually talking about two different things here, right? In this theory, when we talk about the abundance of certain resources, we're talking about completely different things than the environmental scarcity. The environmental scarcity one was focused more on renewable resources. Right? You know what renewable natural resources are? Water, forests. Sorry?
The heat from the
Thermal.
Oh yeah. Thermal. Yeah, that's a horrible word. Thermal. Yeah. So when we talk about these ones, which is another big topic in environmental security, we're not talking about water. Right? The abundance of water, we won't have any conflict because of that. If oil is scarce, will people fight? I don't know. If in a certain region there is no oil, there are many countries where there is no oil at all, and there is no fighting. Right? Costa Rica, most countries where there is no oil, there is no fighting. So it's absolutely, what we talk about, that's why we have to define what is the environment. What is a natural resource? What part of the environment are we actually talking about? I have a whole course coming up on that, and I didn't want to squeeze all of that into 1 hour today. But you're absolutely right. So this one then, trying to go against that theory, but actually using the focus on different resources. So there was a new focus, probably already during or before that environmental scarcity theory became famous, which it became really famous in many countries, and governments based their foreign policy on those outcomes of those studies, right? That environmental scarcity will lead to people suffering internal wars in the global south, and then they would move to the north. And affect the global north's security. That was very, very sexy, right? for the northern security people. The threat of the global south caused by environmental change in the global south, but probably by global northern lifestyles, right? Anyway, so this one, turning the argument around, right, saying the presence of certain resources seems to be linked to the amount of conflict that we see. You've heard the term blood diamonds, natural resources or resource wars, right? Conflict resources. Oil is one of them, right? Gems, diamonds, timber can be a conflict resource, gold. But is that really an issue of abundance, or is it an issue of relative abundance? They are found in some places, but not everywhere. They are not abundant throughout the planet, because if not, they wouldn't be a conflict resource. They are very scarce on a global level. Very valuable. People are willing to go to war over them. Right? Why is oil so important? Come on, guys. You know this. Why is oil important? Why do we fight over oil? Exactly. It's literally the fuel of the global economy. Right? Everything we do, everything we consume needs oil. The production of everything needs oil. Food, clothing, everything. Everything is linked to transport. How do we transport stuff? Ships, planes, everything is based on oil. Plastic. Another example of a conflict resource is called coltan. Have you heard of that before? It's a coltan, I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's French. I'm making this up. I don't know what it's like. But it's a mineral or a mix of minerals that is very much used in computers and cell phones. Okay? And it's a scarce resource, but it's very abundant in certain areas. One of the places where it's mostly found is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And boy, is that a mess, right? Does that sound politically correct? Yes. It's a terrible mess, right, that we have over there. And it's linked to the global demand for that one resource. It's linked to it directly. And the demand coming from all of us, right, for that stuff. We need these machines, and we are kind of pushed to need more and more of that. So these resources become a problem because there's demand for those resources at a global level. Okay? Another important aspect of these resource conflicts is that, again, let me see what the next slide was, is that in some cases, these resources at the beginning were only a way to finance an ideological conflict, right? I was trying to get Amr out of the government. I'm a rebel group. I have access to forests, to timber. I need to get rid of Amr, right? But I need money because I have to feed my soldiers, and I need weaponry. I need guns, right? So how do I get them? I sell the timber to you guys, and with that money, I buy weapons from you guys. And then I fight with Amr. So the resources are there to support my ideological struggle or my conflict. But then, guess what? Sometimes it ends. I win or Amr wins, and that's it. But sometimes my life is great during the conflict. I'm a warlord. Amr sits in his capital selling oil and says, Jan, just sell the timber. You take charge of that, don't bother me. I'm busy fighting another war over here. And I just keep on selling the timber. And my life is great. I'm powerful. I don't know, you can imagine what comes with that. I have no interest to end the conflict. Because if I end the conflict, I have to go back to farming. Or I have to go and rule some backwater community. And that's not as exciting. Now I take whatever I want from anywhere. Right? I can rape. I can have slaves. I'm rich. Everybody's afraid of me. That's great. Right? So there's no more need to actually end the conflict. The resources that I use to finance my ideological conflict become the reason for the conflict to go on. And then it's hard to interfere. Right? When we talked about intervention yesterday, when it comes to that level, how do you intervene? When none of the parties actually wants to end the conflict, because we keep on fighting. We keep sending soldiers to kill themselves. Ammar has to keep up the image of being in charge, and at least that he's trying to beat me. All right. So, like I said, these are different resources. Right? We're not talking about water or land. We're talking about certain resources that can be sold and made into profit and into weapons, into power. Okay, remember we had 3 bigger frameworks. The second one was seeing the environment as a threat to human security. So in a way, we moved from the focus of national security now to studying how does environmental change impact the livelihood, the well-being of individual people and communities. So human security, again, one of those terms that has several meanings, but it's mostly focused on the security at the individual level. We can talk about freedom from several things, peace, safety, access to fundamental rights and participation in decision-making processes. All these take part of human security. So like I said, now with climate change, we have a renewed interest on the suffering of people. How can we prevent the suffering of people? How can we prevent countries from getting to a situation where they cannot feed their populations? So sometimes there are technical issues related to that. Sometimes there are very much social and political issues related to that. Because this is, of course, not just a technical issue, right? When people are vulnerable to environmental change, it's not just because there's environmental change. Because we will be less vulnerable than the poor sectors of societies. You know what I mean? If you think about the very poor in Costa Rica, or the very poor in India, or the very poor in the US, they will suffer the consequences of climate change much more than us, we are the rich, relatively speaking, right? So it's not an environmental issue again. It's also an issue of inequality. Yes, the vulnerability of people, the human insecurity has reasons or causes that lay far beyond just the climate change. Right? This inequality in being vulnerable to certain things was already there before climate change existed. And that is sometimes what we need to address. Right? Why is it that we have poor people in a country that is so rich? How is it possible that we have a country where the rich get richer and the poor get ever poorer and poorer? There's something wrong. So, climate change adaptation or adaptation to global environmental change needs to address these underlying issues, I think. You could also say, well, yes, this is kind of obvious, right? When things change, climate, environmental conditions become harsher, there will be human suffering. I'm getting confused between the mouse, my phone, and this guy. Any questions or comments on this one? Kind of straightforward, I think. But you can make it complicated and political, of course. The third one, now we're switching around, right? We're looking at the environment as being under threat, not the environment being the cause of national insecurity or human insecurity. Now we talk about the environment being under threat from human activity. So we're facing, I think everybody knows that, we're facing some issues. We don't know for sure how bad it's going to be, but we know it's going to be bad, right? Without sounding too dramatic. The environment is changing. We're reaching some levels. Certain indicators show that we're reaching tipping points, right? Where things will change on a systemic level. So we are now, for example, losing more species than ever before in human history. We are currently under, what is the sixth? One of the biggest extinctions of life forms on this planet. Right? In the history of the planet, not just human history. The climate is changing already, and some of them, have you heard these new talks now about, let's stop talking about climate change, let's call it climate crisis, climate disaster. That's really interesting. I think it was that girl, Greta. I forgot her last name. She's amazing. Thank you. I will not repeat it, but yes, that's her last name. So we need to talk about a crisis, right? To get people's attention. No matter what you believe or what let's say nobody knows exactly what's going to happen, right? But things are changing, that's for sure. And some say that it's going to be a huge change that will affect not only our economy, the global economy, it will affect the life on this planet. It is already affecting life on this planet, by the way. And the root causes of that, because it's always easy to say human activity. What does human activity mean? Human activity, so it's all Lisa's fault, right? And my fault? Is it our fault that we have climate change? Is it the poor in Bangladesh that are trying to retreat from rising sea levels? Is it the fishermen in Bangladesh's fault that we have climate change? Or is it the fault of, I don't know, what's his name? Very rich person? There are so many. I can only think of Trump. Whatever, the guy who owns Facebook, is it his fault? Sucker. Little joke. Okay, so is it his fault? Right? Is it the super rich? They have a higher environmental impact, for sure. The more you fly, you have a higher impact on the climate. Right? The more you drive your own car, the bigger your car, the worse it is for the global climate. There are different levels of human activity, right? Can you also blame all the US citizens for the impact of their military on the global climate? Can you imagine calculating the climate change impact of 1,000 military bases? or 400 or 700, I don't know how many they have, but there's a lot. An aircraft carrier, tourism boats, how do you call this, the big cruise ships. It's like a city, right, driving through the ocean. Root causes of, if we step away from this term human activity, there are basically two, again, theories that try to analyze the root causes of global environmental change. And one again is looking at population, and the other one is looking at the economic system. And they will never agree, and they will always fight. And sometimes it's like having a conversation between an atheist and somebody who is a believer. There comes a point where you cannot discuss, right? Because the end is, I believe and I don't. End of story. Because there's no more rational thing. It becomes emotional or spiritual, I don't know. And basically, so these guys say we need to reduce population size. Because we all deserve to be having good lives, right? So if every poor person on the planet will become as rich as us, it's gonna collapse, right? We have more environmental impact than is allowed. So we should reduce our impact so that the poor can rise their levels of impact. These guys are saying it's not really about people, the amount of people, it's the lifestyle. The lifestyle is dictated by an economic system. Right? It's this focus on economic growth, on unlimited economic growth, that is destroying the planet. The climate, the change or the crisis of climate is a symptom of a sick economic system. Right? It's one of the major symptoms that we are seeing. We need more and more oil to keep on growing. If we stop growing, we have an economic crisis. Right? So the system is the system that needs to grow. Also because of internal structures of the capitalist system, but I want to be careful this time and not go too much into that. Yes?
So what is the solution? I mean, for environmental...
Do you think I would be here if I knew?
So my question is actually related to the third effect, environment under threat by human activities. For instance, all transportation vehicles, cars, buses, airplanes, they are running with methane. I mean, the major source in methane is the carbon dioxide. So if we do not use, vehicles, for instance, that lady from Sweden, also I don't know her name, she traveled from Europe to New York, and it took around 2 weeks to get to New York by boat. Yes. So she decided not to use the airplane because of the pollution. If everyone takes, for instance, boat or any other thing, and it takes 2 weeks or 3 weeks to get to Costa Rica from Europe, not from Asia. So is it a proper solution for the problem of the environment which is trapped by the activities of people such as airplane, cars, or let's say population? So yeah, population is another issue. It can be solved in another way. But so any logical, reasonable solution or a way to get rid of this issue, at least for to meet the agenda of 2030, the climate change agreement, Paris climate change agreement.
So, first of all, climate change is not only caused by transportation.
Yeah, many reasons.
Right, many reasons. So transportation is also not just people moving from one place to the other, but it's mostly stuff being sent from different parts of the world to others, right? And many of these things are completely unnecessary to ship them from one part of the planet to the other, right? So take the example of pineapple. We don't really need pineapple, right?
Why don't?
Because it's not necessary.
No, some people
I
like it.
decide that, right?
No.
That's what I'm getting at.
Some
What
people think that.
you have
It doesn't
to,
mean
you have to,
we should not produce this.
you have to consider many different things, right? And who will say what is necessary and what is not? We're coming to almost a philosophical question of what is well-being, what is a good life, right? So I might say, for example, the issue of us flying less, yes, that's important. We should all be flying less, especially with the technology we have that we can actually see us on a screen and talk, right? Flying is pretty silly, if you think about it. Tourism is pretty silly. But I understand, not everybody can live in Costa Rica, right? But so, we're going to talk about that in the course a lot. And yes, there are some companies who are building ships that use sails again and try to sell coffee from Colombia and Central America and send it to the Netherlands on ships of, what do you call those? Like sailing ships, right? Not using oil, like in the old times. And if you manage that correctly, there will be no scarcity of coffee. You just need a lot of sailing ships, wooden ships, and they will be having its chain of transport going back and forth. And there will be constantly coffee getting into Europe. I think it's great. Is it good for business? I don't know. Is it good for the coffee farmers? I don't know. Everything has to be analyzed in all different levels, right? What I'm saying is that under this perspective, the issue that we need to grow economically is causing the environment to suffer, right? And to such consequences, to such levels that it's a planetary crisis, right? Which might affect the same economy. And even beyond that, it might affect the suitability of this planet to sustain life, right? And then it gets scary. Then suddenly you realize, yeah, actually pineapple is not that important, right? For us to have a good life.
How about farmers? How about farmers who are cultivating them?
Well, they can grow something else.
So maybe you say, do not grow bananas, this, people do not need bananas, something like that. So people will not grow anything.
They can grow something that is actually needed to feed people, for example. Pineapples don't feed people.
Potatoes, you mean?
Potatoes, rice, yeah, staple stuff. We have people starving, but the food system, as you saw the other day, right? The food system is a great example of the capitalist system, which is senseless, right? We don't produce food to feed the poor. We produce food to make profit, right? But you will be in my next course.
Yes.
Hi. So I was wondering what you think about economic growth through sustainable enterprises. Like a lot of politicians now say, we're going to grow the economy by creating all these sustainable businesses and jobs based on sustainability.
Okay, I'm trying to think, I'm just making a joke because this is a very good question, but I'm trying to think of how to answer it in a positive way.
Okay.
So in general, anything that can be done better than what we have is good, right? But I am skeptical, always. And it's sad and it's tiring for people who have to listen to me, but also for myself, right? Because I always feel like, I would love to be more optimistic. I think really the point is we have to make things better. We have to find ways to make things better, and nothing is perfect. But anything better is better, right? Even if it's slightly better. Even if we buy a few years, it's better. So anything, what you're talking about is like social entrepreneurship and trying to, right? Doing things in a more environmental friendly, socially friendly way. That's great. I hope they survive. And I think there are examples, of course, of organizations who do that, right? Who measure their success not by economic profit, but by having an impact, right? To have, I don't know, a certain goal that they are reaching through their activities that is not just making money for the shareholders. Any other question or comment? Okay. So, there is the level of, or the intensity of this impact of human activity on the planet has some people led to come up with a new term as the Anthropocene, as a new geological era of the planet. Right? We are having such an impact on the planet that it merits to have a name for this time, right? The human time, the Anthropocene. And again, it's great to create attention to the issue, how serious it is. It gives also a lot of power again to this one. Because if it's humans, the impact is coming from humans, then the less humans we have, the better. Right? So coming back to this Malthusian perspective, that we need to reduce the amount of people on the planet. If we don't take into consideration the inequality that I talked about a minute earlier, if we all were the same, then yes, the problem is the amount of people. And we need to reduce global population. How do you do that? That's the tricky one. In some countries, it has been done, right? I'm talking about China, right? And I am not really in favor of it from an ideological perspective. I think people should decide that on their own. But on the other hand, you could say, man, are we lucky that the Chinese did that? Right? How would China be right now if they had 3 or 4 times their population? How would things be in the world? That's my.
I guess the concern with that, though, and the problem that they're currently having is the growing older adult population has no one to take care of them. So I guess that was my question, like, how do you kind of balance that part with the...
Excellent point. And not only China, right? There are similar problems in many countries. Germany, Japan, I think also. I don't know, some others, in some European countries probably. I know in Germany that's a big, big issue, right? So the proportion of older people is growing. People have less children. Who will take care of them directly, but also who will work in the economy, who is going to make money to support all these people, because they want their pensions. It's a problematic issue, right? It's also a religious topic, right? How do you deal with reducing population size when your religion says you need to multiply and grow, right? And life is sacred and all these things.
I think if I'm not wrong, that's okay, we have many Chinese friends. The regulation regarding having one child in China was changed. Now I think they can have 2 or more. Maybe to rectify myself, 2, yeah. It is also a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will see. Maybe it will change even more in the future, right? Maybe China will need to let foreigners in to work. No? Germany is now thinking, we have this right-wing party, anti-immigrants, and they say they are interested only in the well-being of Germany, and in the economy, and in the future, blah, blah, blah. What they don't understand is that if we don't let more people in, the German economy might collapse in 30 years, right? So, how do you balance these things? So, just to go on a little bit, in the summary then, we could say that the focus inside the environmental security discipline has, I guess the word shifts is too exclusive, but it has moved or integrated apart from the focus on national security. It also integrates the human suffering at the individual level through human security and ecological security when we talk about the whole global ecosystem or the planetary system. So that's the Anthropocene, which some are already criticizing coming from this perspective, right? Which critical political economy is a nice way for saying Marxists, right? Nice in a, well, it doesn't matter, it's a joke. When you say Marxist, everybody thinks, oh, you're a communist, you know? I had that conversation with some of you already. So some of them are saying that the Anthropocene hides the inequality in people, and the real issue is our economic system, right? And therefore, we should call this era the Capitalocene, which is an interesting and funny thing to say. So, coming to this ecological security level, let's say the planet is under threat from human activity. It doesn't make sense to talk about environmental security. So this paradox, which is also something I want you to discuss, basically says that if the environment, right, the environment is changing and threatens the status quo, threatens civilization, threatens the economic system. Environmental change threatens the way we live. But the way we live is causing environmental change. Right? So what are we securing ourselves against environmental change, which is caused by ourselves? Do we secure the environment from us? Do we secure us from the environment? Right, so this is kind of the same thing. This is the status quo that we want. Right? We want to keep on living like this. If we take, again, a critical perspective, this is very elitist, right? Because we can say, we want to live like this, we want to keep the status quo. Half of the world population doesn't want to keep the status quo, because they have pretty horrible lives, right? They don't want to keep things as they are. But let's say in our small population of people, or let's say the people who can choose, say we want to keep civilization and the world as it is, but something needs to change somewhere in this cycle, right? So probably we need to address this to save this, to save this. All clear? Questions? Of the other slides, maybe? I wanted to end on a positive and easy note.
Can you go back one slide?
Yes. This one?
Yeah.
So basically it's saying that what we have right now is a system that will lead to more suffering, to more conflict, maybe even to the extinction of many species, including ours, right? If climate change, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but if the worst case scenario comes true, it's going to be a very different planet to live on. Right? The life of your grandchildren, I'm being optimistic, maybe your children already, will be very different from yours, or might be very different. And again, in most countries of the global south, many people live already in that condition, right? It's new for us. The threat is there for us. A huge number of people on this planet is living in a very different planet than us already. I don't know what's going to happen to them. Right? But there are scary scenarios out there. And if you read what scientists, the top scientists predicted 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, most of what's going on right now is worse than what they predicted. The ice is melting much faster than we thought. And this is only climate change, right? Which is linked to all the other issues, but biodiversity is reduced in, like I said, in huge rates. Right? We're losing ecosystems all over the world. And not only that, we're losing species that we don't even know of. Right? Which again might trigger other changes in those ecosystems that are still there. So as you can see, it's a huge field, right? Can go all the way from discussing the importance of timber and oil in a civil war to planetary system being under threat, going into discussions of capitalism versus too many people. And this is kind of what we try to discuss in our master programs, right? We're going, so it's a development and environment MA. Just for the ones who thought we were studying butterflies or something. Okay, any comments, thoughts?
For the last slide, I would like to add a cultural perspective for the last slide. Last one. Back, and back. This. Root causes. Here we have this political economy, but there's also a cultural perspective. I think one story I can think of is that when my friend and I saw the tomato throwing in a tomato festival in Southern Europe. I said that, well, there are a lot of hungry people around the world, but they are wasting these tomatoes. And my friend said, but they pay for those. So they are entitled to do whatever they want with the tomatoes. So I think here a cultural perspective is the human mentality. You feel entitled to things that you paid for without regarding other aspects. So I think mentality could be another root cause. It's the greed, the human nature of wants.
Yes, absolutely. You could also argue that this is all part of this, right? The culture is influenced by this, or this is influenced by the culture. But yeah, could be. Human nature, that's another one. What is human nature? Is there human nature?
I don't know if this is a question or how to make it a question. I guess my fear is the absence of critical thinking in education these days, because this is a multidimensional problem, and to work your way out, you need multidimensional thinking and creative thinking to solve this. Now, using the tool of capitalism, and I think that's why we're not teaching critical thinking, so that we market to the youth in an easier way. Is there anything happening where we're changing the narrative, where we're actually using that marketing tool to have people see the sense and how it benefits them? Not just, I want my car today, but I want my kids, like you said, my kids and my grandchildren, to live at least in a livable world.
Are you asking me if we are changing the narrative in the educational system? Or?
Yeah, I guess is there something in place, because I see it happening in academia. You know, I see it in the books and I see it in the talk up here, but I don't see it filtering down to marketing to the people who are going to be making the change in the future.
I want to believe that that's what we're doing here at UPeace. That's why I think it's important when we talk about environmental issues and social issues, that they are always political issues, right? There is no such thing as an environmental issue alone. They're all political issues. Political meaning that deal with power, that deal with structures, with a system, right? That is behind what we observe, and the things that make us mad, the things that we see that are unjust, the things that scare us are all symptoms of a systemic problem, right? I don't think it trickles down. When I read some of the mainstream documents of global organizations, I still think it's too, it's not aggressive enough, right? And they don't use words that are clear enough. It's keeping everything vague, right? Because, let's be honest, most people who can deal with this problem of, or with the fear of their children not being able to have a good life by just focusing on becoming rich, which plays right into the hand of that economic system, right? So it's individualizing, another characteristic of capitalism, right? To everybody on their own, fight for your own, and make sure that you are rich enough so that your kids won't suffer. Climate change will come, yeah, but my kids will be relatively okay. Instead of saying, let's organize and change the system, which is, man, that's tough, right? I know that's the solution, but in many things, I do things completely the other way. I think only about myself or my kids.
Kind of going back to the structural insecurity, way back at the beginning. I'm just kind of making connections. I don't know if it's really a question or more.
What is the structural scarcity?
Yeah, structural insecurity or
This one?
yeah. So talking about unequal access to resources, can this also include like physical barriers, like to those with in a wheelchair, stairs versus a ramp? Does that also count as like a?
I think we can make it count,
Okay.
but I don't know if he or they were talking about these issues.
Right.
I think it was more a focus on preventing access directly with a purpose, right? That
I mean, you could say one could build with stairs instead of a ramp to prevent that access, but
Right,
that would be a very specific intentional.
I think it's more about dealing with power, right? Saying, I don't want you to be here. I don't want you to have access to this water. Or I can say you will only have this amount of water while I choose what to do with the rest, right? But it could be, it's an interesting point.
Can I add something?
Please.
I would say structural scarcity would include. I just wanted to add, I think structural scarcity would include scarcity or exclusion on the basis of different aspects of our lives. For example, ability, gender, race, etc. So I think those are informed by power imbalances structurally. So
Yeah.
That's why.
I know you are aware of this, but just to let you know, I actually wrote my paper for Yang's OSA class last semester on structural scarcity as related to physical disability. So if you're interested in that, like specifically in Costa Rica and as it relates to ecotourism, so if you'd be interested in reading that, you are more than welcome to.
Yeah, awesome paper. So it was about how ecotourism is basically an elitist activity, right? Because not everybody has access to these types of tourism.
This is more of just a general question. I do think the vast majority of the time, the structural scarcity does point to power and an intentional prevention of certain populations or certain aspects of society not having access to the resources or whatever we're talking about. But can you speak to where in this kind of framework and this broader just history of environmental security as a field, I guess like the unintentional consequences that through environmental conservation or environmental protection, certain groups are left out of that dialogue and therefore are negatively impacted, even if it's not about necessarily power inherently?
That's a big question. So if I understood you correctly. You talked about conservation, restricting access to local communities to certain resources for the greater good or whatever, right? So if a country decides to create a national park, the question that we ask ourselves in that course that was mentioned, the OSA course, which is a field course, is for whom do we conserve nature, right? Who is benefiting from the existence of a national park? The local community definitely not, because they're not allowed anymore to get in there, which they used to do forever. Hunting, gathering food, timber, fibers, medicine, suddenly they're excluded. And who benefits from a national park then? Is it the tourists? Is it the country? Is it people in San Jose who do have the money to go there and visit it, who can pay $100 for a guide? Without a guide, you're not allowed to get in. So you're creating structural scarcity. It's a great example. Is that kind of what you meant?
Yeah, I guess just how it relates to the geography and statement.
Listo. Okay, thank you very much, and see you around.